Okay. All right.
Good afternoon. It is 4:31 on Monday, September 20th. Let the record show that a quorum of board members is present and that this meeting has been duly called and that its notice has been posted in accordance with Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code Chapter 551. And I don't think we have anybody that signed up for community input, so we will dive into our meeting item 4, information and discussion, 2021-2022 draft of superintendent targets.
Good afternoon, everybody. And the first thing I want to do is welcome Dustin Harden, our new Chief Technology Officer. We are thrilled that you are joining us this afternoon. So we convened in July 24th, and with the board, and shared some proposed priorities from relating to the strategic plan in particular, but also community-based accountability report, and proposed some priorities for the year. And over the last 5 weeks, approximately 6 weeks plus, we've been focused on planning work in those areas for the coming year and engaging in work related to those areas. And tonight we are bringing to you draft superintendent targets, and they are similar in substance to superintendent targets that have been proposed in previous years, slightly different format, as you'll see this evening. And so Dr. Shelby McIntosh, who is managing partner from Ed Elements and who joined us in July, has been supporting our work throughout this process and is here this evening as well to support our work. And she's going to give an introduction to some of the themes that informed our work, and then various team members will present each of the 4 superintendent targets. There'll be opportunities for board members to ask questions and to share some reactions. And then at a future board meeting, we would bring superintendent targets back for consideration as an action item, and we would take any feedback that you give us this evening to inform any potential revisions between now and that meeting. As in really, the exact time we get at will be determined by a discussion tonight. Hypothetically, we could bring it back as early as a week from Monday, recognizing with the delayed meeting we have shorter turnaround. If we need to take more time in order to process any feedback, we can do that as well. And so the only other comments I'll make by way of introduction is just the observation that these 3 documents represented by the concentric circles you see on this slide, community-based accountability report, our strategic plan, and then the superintendent targets will be that the board will adopt coming out of this conversation, really provide guidance for school level and district level team members. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Dr. McIntosh.
Thank you. It's so good to see you all again. Thanks so much for having me back. I just wanted to give, I think, a little bit of revisiting our roots of this work and why we started out on this adventure to begin with, and then just some contextual information to help provide, I think, some foundational shared understanding about how we approached monitoring and superintendent targets for this project. So one thing I shared with you all when I met you back in July is that the specific approach that we took to thinking about strategy and planning for this school year is that rather than seeking to create the perfect plan, we wanted to plan for change, knowing that it has always been true in public education that the world around us rapidly changes and we have to be flexible and nimble to respond to that. But even more than ever now, we know that there really is no perfect plan that does not have an expiration, right? That we have to have a plan that makes sense for now and have the practice and the structure in place that allows us to respond as our needs change and as the context around that plan changes. So all of what you will see tonight is strategy that is born out of that idea that we are planning for change and not perfection, and that we want a plan and we want practices around that plan that allow us to iterate as we go, as we learn once we put that plan into practice. You may remember this image. I shared this with you last time as well, that oftentimes strategic planning is done with this vision of we have a very clear starting line and a very clear finish line, and there's this straight kind of linear path that gets us from A to B. And we know that in reality, it looks a lot more like this. That as we go, we have obstacles crop up. We have challenges that we didn't anticipate occur. Lots of different things in our path that could throw us off course or prevent us from getting to that finish line. And one of the parts of this image that kept coming up that really resonated with people is that you actually have multiple flags here. It's not just the one end goal, but there are multiple milestones that oftentimes these flags move, or there's all of a sudden an obstacle that's going to prevent us from getting, from one kind of checkpoint to the next checkpoint. And so this part of this image, more really than anything else, informs how we think about monitoring a strategic plan and really informed how we thought about superintendent targets. I love that it has multiple checkpoints here, and so a lot of what you're going to hear, for me at least in the next 5 minutes or so, is born out of this idea that there's not just one finish line, that there actually are multiple checkpoints that we need to evaluate and learn from as we go. So because of that, there are a few things just about monitoring and metrics in particular that I want to share with you that, as Dr. Williams said, will really shape the targets that you hear from the team this evening. In particular, we see monitoring metrics as something that needs to teach us, that we need to learn from as we go. They should be the things that signal to us when to keep going, whether or not we need to pivot in our strategy, whether or not we should think about something completely different than we did in the beginning. But ultimately, they are the things that should tell us if the changes that we are hoping to see are actually occurring, and if they are they attributable to the plans and the strategies and the initiatives that we put in place. In other words, is there a causal connection between what we're seeing and the decisions that we made to try to create that change? So we think about these metrics in 3 different buckets, and there are arrows in between them on purpose because we almost view that as a progression, and I'll walk you through that here. But that first bucket there, as it says, is fidelity, and just like it sounds, these would be metrics that measure the extent to which we are actually doing the things we said we were going to do. So we're looking at the changes that we planned, the initiatives, the programs, and evaluating and assessing how well that is going. Are we actually implementing what we said we would? Then we can look at that kind of second bucket there around effectiveness, which is, okay, if we are implementing what we planned with fidelity, are we seeing the changes we expected those decisions to create? Is it having the desired effect that we thought it would whenever we made those decisions to begin with? And then we look at impact, which is honestly usually where people go first when they think about monitoring a strategic plan, because those are always designed around the impact we're trying to have on our target population, which is usually our students, sometimes our families more broadly. But impact would be those longer-term sustained changes that we are hoping these decisions we make now will ultimately have on those groups of people. A very simplified way to think about this, Fidelity, did we do what we said we would? Effectiveness would be changes in staff as a result of what we did, or another way to say that would be changes in adult behavior that were born out of those decisions that we made. And then ultimately the change in students. You could also say changes in families that we hoped to see if we changed adult behavior by those practices that we put in place. I'm going to walk you through one more look at this because I think it helps to kind of see these metrics in practice. But I like to think of them almost like a decision tree. So, and I mentioned that there are arrows between these buckets because we do think of them like a progression. That progression would look something like this, where first, when we're monitoring our plan, we ask that question of, are our plans being implemented as we intended them to be implemented? And you might have a yes answer to that, you might have a no answer to that, you might have something in between. If you can say yes, this program, this decision, this initiative is actually being implemented like we planned, then you can ask that question about whether or not it's leading to those changes in adults that you hoped for. But if the answer is no, before you can even get there, the question becomes why not? Why isn't it being implemented like we planned? Is there a barrier there that we did not anticipate? Is there something completely outside of this program or this decision that is disrupting our ability to implement it well? But that has to be answered and solved for before we can start looking at and evaluating effectiveness. And then the same thing happens, let's just for discussion purposes, assume the answer to that question is yes, we're implementing this plan as we intended to. Then we can ask that question, is it leading to these changes in adult practices and behaviors that we hope to see? Again, the answer to that question is yes or no or somewhere in between. And if that answer is no, we have to ask that same why not question. So if we're not seeing those changes in adults, is it because we made an assumption about what would happen and that assumption turned out not to be true? Is it that, again, something in our environment has changed that means that that decision doesn't quite make sense anymore? But that answer has to be, or that question has to be answered before we can evaluate impact. But that is when we would look at, okay, if the program's being implemented like we planned, if we're seeing these changes in adults as a result, are those changes having the impact on our kids that we want, that we intended from the beginning? Hopefully the answer to that question is yes, and then it makes sense to continue to invest resources, time, money, all the things. Maybe we even want to make a decision to scale or expand that effort because we were able to say yes here. And if the answer is no, again, the question becomes why not, and there's a decision point about where we go from there. So hopefully that shows you kind of a progression between those both kind of formative and evaluative type of metrics. This next section, this is more so from like an operational standpoint. I shared this with the district team to think through as they start digging deep into these projects and these action items, and as they get to these checkpoints and start looking at the data that they collect around these metrics. But I wanted to share it with you too, just so you could see how we anticipate that data and that monitoring should be used. We talked about 4 major decision points here. If we are seeing what we hope to see in the data, then there's an obvious continued progress there, or continued progress decision there. But if the data is not showing what we hope that it would, there becomes a question of, do we pivot to something slightly different here? Do we pause it? Do we sunset this strategy or this initiative altogether? I won't go through the details of the criteria there. I know you've got to print out. But just for an example purposes, I'll point you to one criteria under pause. It may be that it is requiring a lot of resources and we're just not seeing the return that we expected to. You might decide to put that initiative on pause, understand it a little bit more before you continue to invest in it with time or money or other resource. So just calling that out as an example, these are the types of kind of discussions and thinking that we'd like to see at those flag points that I showed you on that image. So rather than waiting until kind of an artificial finish line to evaluate historically, we want to be evaluating this as we go so that we can make responsive decisions like this. Just a couple more things. One thing I want to mention just about that pivot decision there. Oftentimes this word can be very scary and very disruptive for people to hear. And I want it known and to be clear that pivoting is not a change in vision. That it's very clear from this work that there is a shared vision of what the district hopes to accomplish and the impact you all hope to have for kids and families. But that we want to be open to changing our strategies for how to get there. And that's really what those decision points are about, allowing for that adaptability and flexibility as we learn as we go. And so the last thing I'll talk you through here before I turn it back over to Dr. Williams, we have some guiding beliefs that really guided us through the process of drafting these proposed targets today. I'll just walk you through them, and then I'm sure you're going to see how these show up in the targets as the team shares them with you. But the first one there, I've alluded to this a little bit already, that in order for us to really plan for change, we wanted to think about these targets in both a formative way and a summative way. So you likely saw this as I talked about the different types of metrics and how to use them in kind of a responsive planning structure. But rather than only thinking about them from an evaluative standpoint, from a summative standpoint, what kind of targets can we look at to help us also guide our work as we go from more of a formative standpoint? That second one there around effectiveness and impact metrics, it's noting that it's possible those may change. If we go through that decision tree type of exercise and find out early on that fidelity is not happening, that a strategy is not working out, there may be a decision there to make a pivot which could impact what those effectiveness and impact metrics are. Want to make sure those are really tightly aligned and just kind of setting the expectation that if a responsive decision has to be made there based on what we learn, that those could change, and we would want them to change in order to make sure they still make sense. The third one there is specific to how the Board of Trustees might use these superintendent targets. We know that your work is very much geared towards governance purposes. And so we were thinking about the content there. There was always this lens of what kind of decisions would we want to make from a governance standpoint, and keeping them at the level that made sense there. Important to note that there are likely going to be much more detailed monitoring plans that the district team would use for more of an operational standpoint. So I wouldn't look at these targets and think this is the only data we're going to look at and the only type of decision we're going to make, but it made sense for these to be the ones from a governance perspective. I think another important point, this isn't on the slide, but another important point that I will mention here is, should also be noted that these superintendent targets aren't reflective of all of the work happening in the district, right? They are targets that are aligned with what came out of those focus areas and what seemed to be very high priorities for the district this year, but by no means should they be considered representative of all of the work that's happening across the district this year. Just two more there. The second one is around impact. Impact takes time, we know this, especially when it comes to student achievement. And so if we are following this process of looking at fidelity and effectiveness first and really learning from that, it is possible that impact metrics come later. Just know, again, that is a recognition that authentic impact, if we're measuring it in a right way, we have to measure it at an extent that we feel like that impact could have already occurred. And then the last one there, positive trends and signs of growth. This is hard because oftentimes I think our human nature is we want to have a target with a very specific number around it and want to feel like we can evaluate good or bad based on that number. And just in my work in this area over time, I've learned that oftentimes those like very specific numbers can do more harm than good, that they give you kind of an artificial sense of either success or failure. But rather what we want to see is positive trends, signs of growth, seeing that things are trending in the direction we would want them to or expect them to give us an indication that yes, this was the right decision for us, or yes, we want to continue to invest our time and energy and money here. So you'll see that show up as well when you look at the metrics. That is really what we wanted to ground those decisions in positive trends, signs of growth rather than an artificial target that might give us the wrong signal. Thank you.
Very good.
All right, I think I'm good. I'll hand it back over to you.
So, next, staff members will present each of the 4 targets. Then board members will have the opportunity to ask clarifying questions. And so staff will present all 4 targets. Then Mr. Cunningham will facilitate 2 rounds of questions by trustees. And that will be, those questions will be focused on one superintendent target at a time. And then board trustees would have the opportunity to share reactions to the superintendent targets, and trustees might comment on 1, 2, 3, 4. All, it depends on whether or not what you choose to use your time speaking about. And then at the end, staff would briefly reflect on what we've heard. And so Dr. Bader is going to provide some introductory remarks relating to the format.
All right, good afternoon. The proposed superintendent targets have a certain structure that have some similar qualities or traits that those who were on the board in previous years were accustomed to. So, for example, there's a priority area. We have the alignment to the community-based accountability pillar, our strategic plan strategy, and the accompanying result statement. The other piece that is similar to our previous superintendent targets that you're used to is the impact metrics. So are we able to identify some of those authentic impact metrics, in which case sometimes those will take time more than this school year. The additional parts that have not been in the superintendent targets, but we've had lots of conversation about, are first looking at fidelity. I know that question has come up time and time again. Are we seeing the same level of intervention or implementation across all of our campuses? That's something we've talked about for many years, and we finally see it and are using it in our superintendent targets. To what extent have we implemented our action step? Then we have the effectiveness metrics. Again, we focused so much on the impact metrics, but this year, in addition to fidelity and impact metrics, we are also looking at the effectiveness and that essential change in adults. Are adults doing what we said we would? There are also checkpoints in all these, and those stated checkpoints help to calibrate our work in relation to the fidelity, effectiveness, and impact metrics if they're there. And those checkpoints are internal. It's to keep us honest about what we're saying and what we're doing, and to align our work. I want to bring us back to this diagram. In the past, we have often looked to that final flag of identifying those impact metrics, or in other words, our strategic intent, our vision. What I love about this work is that we're not just looking at that last flag, we're also looking at the previous flags of how we're iterating our planning and using our checkpoints along the way, whether we see the peaks or where we see those valleys and dips, to refine our work and to pause or reflect and make sure that, one, are we implementing our work and our interventions and are we implementing our work with fidelity, and is there effectiveness? The journey is as important, if not more important, than the destination, because that's where we truly make our work. That is the responsive nature of the strategic planning and the responsive nature of the superintendent targets. So first, we must ensure that we have fidelity. Otherwise, that impacts metrics that we've looked for in the past, we want to make sure it doesn't happen by chance. Second, we must ensure effectiveness, so that those actions that we've led really lead to a change in that effectiveness, or how adults are responding to that intended target. And last, we look for the long-term sustainable impact, which is typically the student outcomes. And so it is the journey that is often more important than the destination, but we intend to get to that destination because our vision doesn't change.
And so this slide lists the priority areas reflected in each of the 4 superintendent targets. You see, for example, with health and safety, the reference to the community-based accountability pillar, specifically safety and well-being, and then you see the reference to the strategy within the strategic plan. In addition to the slide deck, you'll each have a consolidated 3-page document that lists the information on this slide as well as the specific metrics. So that just is one summary page. And so let's go ahead and dive in. I appreciate your patience with us giving these framing remarks. But Dr. Baird will take the lead in presenting the superintendent target relating to health and safety.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. First, I'd like to thank Mr. Brian Palazzi for leading the sprint team. That team did a lot of good work in developing the priority and everything that built in to lead up to this target. So as Dr. Williams mentioned, the pillar is related to safety and well-being, as well as strategy 1 from our strategic plan will foster a safe and nurturing environment. And the specific result statement is that we'll have an intentional focus on safety and security. And so our first Fidelity metric is that we have a tiered system of mitigation strategies that are designed to influence changes in data in our COVID-19 dashboard. This rose to a level of importance. We didn't want to at this point, especially this past June. We didn't think we'd be here, but yet we are. And so it is important, it is risen to that challenge. Now, it's not that we're developing mitigation strategies. We have the mitigation strategies in place. This is about fidelity, making sure that wherever we are in those mitigation steps, that across our campuses we have the same structures in place and the same implementations in place. That's the fidelity part of it. So we have a checkpoint here for November, but the reality is there are constant checkpoints throughout the year internally that we're checking to make sure that fidelity is there. The second metric is mental health resources and supports for students exist at each campus. And so again, we'll do a checkpoint in November for this. It's not to say that we are developing mental health resources, not for this target. We have mental health resources such as skills-based small groups on campuses to support students. We have individual counseling during individual needs of personal crisis. We have a social and emotional learning curriculum, whether it's through Character Strong, Purposeful People, or Leader in Me. So different programs, but the same levels of supports at each of our campuses. And then we also have, as another example, prevention specialists that provides appropriate lessons. So this gives us an opportunity to see how well those lessons are being implemented at each campus. Next, we move to effectiveness. And so for the mitigation strategies, we will look to see that mitigation strategies are being followed as evidenced by classroom, campus, and district observations. We don't have impact metrics for this, but remember, not everything is going to see, we'll take this year for those impact metrics, but for this particular strategy, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to impact because of what we're seeing in the community that often has an impact on our campuses directly. However, we are able to define metrics related to the mitigation strategies, and we are able to see that those strategies are implemented across our campuses or specific classrooms and in district observations. For example, in the last couple of weeks, we have had C&I members, curriculum instruction members, going out to campuses just to identify first what's happening on all the campuses, and then to see if we have standardization across all of our campuses related to effectiveness, though. And then related to the mental health resources, the effectiveness there is that metric is students, staff, and families have access to and utilize resources and supports based on individual need, including connections with community partnerships and individual group student conferencing as measured by numbers of counselor requests and visits. We have some great partnerships in the district, such as with communities and schools and the Bay Area Alliance. We also have different clinicians that we have strong partners with. And we also have, related to staff, our employee assistance program. So those things we're able to see of how much use our student, staff, and families are getting out of our supports and resources, and we're able to provide a formal checkpoint somewhat in February, even though we're able to access that and look at that throughout the year. For this particular metric, action, we do have an impact metric, which is students feel their campus and district supports their mental well-being. We're able to assess that through our climate survey and look at how well students felt supported in previous years.
So we'll go ahead and transition to literacy development. We'll complete each of the superintendent targets and then come back for questions relating to each of them and how it uses typically on this one.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And just as a reminder, back to the pillar that we were talking about student readiness, and this has been certainly the strategy about designing and learning experiences. This has been a long path. It's not a new one for us. This is one that we've started and will continue on. But our specific result is certainly learning opportunities to ensure that our students achieve at high levels of learning. And we certainly know that road begins with reading. And the stronger readers we have, we know that we are going to have stronger outcomes with students. And so this is specifically this development and the work that we're doing from our sprint team and our work team is for pre-K-12. We're lifting up in this target specific measures to share back with you on kinder and first and the early and through second, the early grades, but this is not, the work that we're doing does reach pre-K through 12 and the literacy path for all of our learners. We are taking this spotlight because we are investing so much time, as we talked about this in previous sessions. You've heard a lot about those reading academies, all of our the unprecedented work from the legislative session on House Bill 3, in which our administrators are spending 42 hours. Dr. Williams spent several of those hours with us last week, and ongoing learning, as well as our teachers in 60 hours each, and we're focusing on K and 1 this year. We'll move to second and third grade next year, and anyone who reaches reading in those levels, administratively or in teaching reading, they're involved in this work. So it is a significant impact of time, effort, and energy, and we want to make sure that we are reaching and creating a system to support that. But it's not for compliance, but it is for changed outcome. As we work to the fidelity of implementation of teaching the science of reading, and for all stakeholders, we know there's clarity that we are already gaining from this work and in our system that we will be implementing as we move forward, as we create these systems of support. So just for reference, you know that, and I know you know this, but in K and 2, we typically have those guided reading lessons. It's a small group instruction that we build time in every day to work on reading levels and reading instruction and reading assessments. And then moving to 3rd through 5th grade, it moves on to looking at guided reading and more strategy group work, where we're looking at, these are readers that are learning to read for a purpose, and that they're having to use specific strategies to conquer more significant text. And then we move to 6th to 8th grade. That's when it starts shifting, and I'm going to speak for Dr. Engel a bit here and share that this is when we have those targeted classes, those targeted reading classes in which we've identified students who are in need and that have need for literacy development, and they're specifically identified to receive those a specific curriculum for their literacy instruction. It's parallel to a regular ELA classroom, but it is specific to their needs to grow their literacy development as a reader. And I know we've used a lot of terms, and even in this term, we have something up there called BAS, and we've talked about that before, but something you'll hear again. I just want to clarify, the BAS is the benchmark assessment system. And it's a system of assessment that we use in our district, as well as multiple other systems of assessment. But BAS is one that we use primarily for every student, K through 2 and 3 through 6, 7 for those students that are identified in need. We also use an additional assessment for Amplify and the M-class assessment and Amplify. And so just to share some of that assessment, just so that you see the whole of our work. In BAS, we're studying the use for and assessing every learner their fluency and their comprehension in reading. We use the M-Class assessment. We're looking for phonics, decodable skills, and also screening them for dyslexic tendencies. So we use those tests at K1 and 2. So that's a lot about our literacy pathway, but let's jump in real quickly to this target, which I know is our intent for this discussion, but without context, it's not as, it has to have that behind it. So looking at our Fidelity metrics, certainly talking about the resources that have been created, revised, and promoted. Part of this is also creating a district-wide team and campus teams to refocus and establish the metrics that we're going to be using to support these systems and the implementation. As we look at that, one thing that we've created is kind of a pathway to reading comprehension, which all of you are readers in here, so just to share that this will be part of what we're lifting up and implementing and bringing to life into our classrooms, and that's a piece of that will be implemented. That'll be the Fidelity that we'll be looking at both the district and campus level. And the K1 teachers, they have 11 months to create, to finish the Reading Academy, and we have all of our teachers involved in that right now. So those are pieces that we'll be tracking as we go through the year and through December and June. We look over at the effectiveness matrix. We'll definitely be looking at classroom data at the district level and at the campus level based on tools that we have created to determine the level and the fidelity. The piece that is so important here is on this long path is the new knowledge that we've gained, the new tools that we're implementing, and to the fidelity in which they're being implemented. And so that'll be important information for us to gain back at the district level and to monitor at the campus level and at the district level. And then certainly using another term that's in here is the PLC, which Dr. Silva will talk a little bit about. You've heard it previously, so I know you know about it, but I know she's going to share some more about that. But they'll be using those teams at the campus to monitor that data and to continue to learn and to implement responsive strategies to the data that we're receiving. And then finally, back to that assessment that I started with, thinking about the BAS and the Amplify, we'll be definitely looking at and demonstrating the need for the growth that we've seen in students and that we have seen in our reading and our readers in this year, that we want our students reading on level as evidenced by that BAS, but we'll also be using additional assessments. And I, of course, focused in on the elementary a bit, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit more about our learners and the intermediate level, especially as they grow on their path of literacy development. There is a new assessment that's going to be implemented this year in 7th grade, in which TEA has requested that we implement an assessment for any student who is below level and identified below level. And so there'll be a new RAPS, another acronym for you guys, Reading Analysis Prescription System that will be used for our 7th graders. That we'll be monitoring in the background, and this will be our first year to implement that, for teachers to implement that, and for us to receive the data on that, so we'll be looking at that as well. So although this target lifts up specific data at a narrow subset, this is a much larger reach that is developing even beyond the elementary years. And so I'm sure we'll have more conversation about that as we go. But Dr. Sylvie, want to talk about PLCs?
All right. Well, I will share a little bit about the Engaging First-Time Instruction Superintendent Target. So just to review again, it connects to our pillar of student learning and progress and our strategy 2 of our current strategic plan. We will design and implement learning experiences that inspire student achievement, agency, and growth. Specifically looking at results statement 1, expanded learning opportunities to foster growth for each learner. So for the Engaging First-Time Instruction, there's really sort of 2 chunks of this target. And the first chunk is around personalized learning. So our Fidelity matrix is that teachers receive high-quality professional learning tied to engaging first-time instruction. And in the metric, you see some reference to our wave 1 of the personalized learning initiative. So I wanted to share a little bit about that and personalized learning in general in CCISD. And most of you know that historically we've been working on personalized learning for the last several years, but most of our work has focused around really moving from a teacher-centered classroom to a learner-centered classroom. And we've encouraged campuses and teachers to work to empower students through flexible learning opportunities, as well as the use of goal setting, which some of you are familiar with. We've focused around providing choice in 3 different aspects of learning: in the way that students access content, and in the way they engage or process content, and then finally in the way they demonstrate mastery of that content. So this year, we have begun work with education elements, as you know, with Shelley Hill here visiting us, but we have a professional learning support around personalized learning to continue to develop those skills in our teachers and eventually experiences and learning for our students. This year we'll focus on 10 elementary schools, which we've identified as our Wave 1 campuses, and they are Armand Bayou Elementary, Bay, Ferguson, Gilmore, Hyde, North Point, Parr, Ross, Weber, and Wedgwood. So we'll be focusing that work on those 10 schools in our Wave 1, but not solely. So in our larger perspective, education elements will be working with us on professional development, really for all of our instructional coaches across our elementary, our intermediate, and our high school campuses, as well as our district level support staff. So we will have several layers of work throughout the year focused on personalized learning. So these instructional leaders, the coordinators, and the coaches, they will continue to work really on every campus, sort of in line and with the Wave 1 campuses. While this year we're planning the specific focus on those Wave 1 schools, we have plans in future years to grab another set in Wave 2, which would be next school year, another 9 or so elementaries and half of our intermediates, and then Wave 3, similarly another 9 or so elementaries, and then the other 5 intermediates. So over the course of the next few years, we'll really have all elementary and intermediate schools included in that work with education elements. So that is the focus this year. Back to the Fidelity matrix and the effectiveness matrix, we will look for, in those 10 Wave 1 schools, we will look at our classroom walkthrough data to see the evidence or look for the evidence of those personalized learning strategies that are used with our students, that we will be learning through that process with the work with Ed Elements. So our second chunk of engaging first-time instruction is the highly functioning PLCs, professional learning communities, that really are so high functioning that they are using data to drive and plan instruction. And there are several layers of PLC development and understanding and effectiveness before we get to the real heart of the work, which is that understanding and using data to drive instruction. Just a little bit more about PLCs. We engage in work of PLCs to really increase the effectiveness and the collective efficacy of our teacher groups. So we know that a teacher team that is working closely together and collaboratively is providing the best learning opportunities for our students. We feel like all students benefit when teachers are working together to plan their lessons, and they design the best quality instruction when that happens. We engage in PLCs to ensure every student masters the most essential standards of each grade level or course in secondary. This is done through intentional supports, interventions, and targeted learning experiences. Our PLCs go through a process of looking at the curriculum and looking at the standards or the TEKS and identify essential standards, lift the high priority learning standards, which are already identified in our curriculum, and then focus on their essential standards and provide interventions, the RTI process, extension, everything to make sure that our students really understand and master those essential standards that are identified. So a little bit about our PLC journey in CCISD. Of course, it started several years ago, but in the last year or two, we've really had pretty intense professional learning around strategic, explicit, intentional ways to form a PLC and get into the true work of a PLC. We've created structures and systems to make sure that our PLCs are effective. In our secondary schools specifically, we've made a lot of strides in that direction to build opportunities for collaboration and ownership, that belief and the culture of ownership of all of our students, and we're kind of in this together. We've had, as you know, we have instructional coaches at our secondary level now, leading conversations and really holding tight to the fidelity of a PLC model. The campuses have structured planning, common planning time, which wasn't a thing in our secondary schools a few years ago, as well as they created, most of them have created their guiding coalition or are in the process of creating their guiding coalition. And then they will work to utilize data to ensure progress monitoring and using that data to guide whatever the next instructional steps are for the students. So we're committed to continuing this work to engage teachers in learning so that they will ensure growth of each of our students. So our effectiveness matrix for the PLC work is that teachers and campus administrators report that data is used in the PLCs and is helping them to provide the most engaging and effective first-time instruction.
So, as with the other targets, these superintendent targets will rise to the level of focused efforts that you'll see in campus planning. Campus planning is aligned to the superintendent targets. This particular target, the emphasis is on instruction, engaging first-time instruction. And so the impact metrics, which typically we see with students, those will come about, but just not this year. It's important that we get them right and that we work to develop these with the emphasis this year being on the effectiveness with the instruction. And so for that reason, you see the checkpoints in both March and May so that we continue to not only ensure fidelity, but also that effectiveness with how the adults are utilizing professional learning through the Wave 1 schools as well as the professional learning communities across our K-12 schools.
And the final target is on budget planning. And you guys are used to seeing this long-range plan. It shows over the next few years we're going to have some financial challenges that we're needing to meet. And so this metric, this pillar is fiscal and fiscal operational systems. Strategy 4, we will expand the organization's capacity to accomplish our strategic intent. And so the fidelity metric is we have a 3 to 5 year financial plan that has options for expenditure reductions and revenue enhancements. If you remember from this document, where revenues are dropping over the next 3 to 5 years, that's a combination of that transition aid that we're getting right now from House Bill 3, and also we're seeing enrollment kind of going up and down, up and down. So we're not sure about how that enrollment's going to end up in the next 3 to 5 years. And we're counting on that our enrollment growing over the next 3 to 5 years. And so we really need to put something in place that's going to put us on a pathway to where in 3 to 5 years, we can say, we're balancing the budget, we're not using capital plan funds to do that. And the only way to do that is to get together a group of people and work through options that we can present to internal staff and to the board for revenue enhancements and for expenditure reductions. So that's the basic Fidelity metric we're looking at, is a 3 to 5 year financial plan to make that happen. The effectiveness metrics are, we will make financial decisions that align with our long-term planning, and our district does not use more than 20% of capital or contingency funds in any given fiscal year. So the goal is to eventually get off of the use of those capital and contingency funds. We know that in the interim, there's going to be some usage. We're trying to keep that to a minimum. We don't want to draw down those funds. Even though that plan, the contingency plan, was set up probably 15 years ago with the idea that in just this type of a situation, we could go back and use that money, that capital and contingency funds, on a short-term basis until we can get ourselves back to some fiscal, some standardization in our fiscal revenue and expenditures. So the goal is not to overuse that. We know we're going to have to use it a little bit over the next few years, and we're going to look at ways to minimize that to at least no more than 20% of the amount in that contingency fund at any given year. We've got about $55 million, $54 million in the fund right now, estimated, subject to some adjustments at year end. And then the impact metric, our multi-year financial plan effectively informs financial decisions in support of our strategic plan, as indicated by the perception of trustees, cabinet members, and community members. And the checkpoint there is long-term. That's a long-term goal of ours through this process. This is not going to be an easy metric to put target to put into place. It's going to require a lot of work over the next year. There's some things we can probably do this year to help ourselves in the following years. A lot of the work is going to be geared towards what are we going to have to do next year and the following year and the following year, because we can't do this all at once. We're going to have to step into this over time, and the only way to do that is to have a good plan that this is what we're going to look at in this year and how we're going to meet those challenges. So that's all I have on the budget planning side.
So those are the overviews of the superintendent target priorities in 4 areas. And so we will shift then, and we'll start with, Mr. Cunningham will facilitate this next part with, basically there'll be 2 rounds of questions for each target area. We'll do 1 target area, then move on to questions for the next, and the third, and then the final. And so we were envisioning 2 rounds of questions for each of those 4 areas. And then after that, there'd be 1 reaction round in which trustees would share reactions related to as many as they would like to comment on before staff have an opportunity to briefly reflect.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. First of all, I wanted to thank all of our presenters for the thought that went into, and I know the work since, well, before school started, when the administrative mini camps and things of that nature. I know you guys have been working on this, so thank you very much. As mentioned before, we're going to go through the 4 superintendent targets. We're going to have 2 rounds of clarifying questions. I'll start with Mr. Larson and come down the line to myself, and then we'll go back, okay? Before moving on to the next target, we'll do the same exact thing to kind of keep that rolling. Keep in mind too, at the very end, we're going to have some reaction time where just give your thoughts, feelings, etc. So.
Mr. Cunningham, can I ask a question that's actually pre the board strategies?
Yes.
And maybe not going against, although maybe I can make that happen, my question, but, and it might actually be more for you, but, so my question lies in I guess the use of the word strategy, and the definition of that. because there's this slide that is about pivoting and a change in strategy without a change in vision. So I guess my question is, I wonder about the use of the word strategy versus the use of the word initiative as we would understand it, or maybe action plan as we've known it in the past, or something along those lines. Because when I look at the strategic plan, I wouldn't necessarily see us changing those 5 strategies that we have, but I could see changing initiatives within those. So it's a clarification issue, the word strategy.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. As you can imagine, vernacular in this space is tricky because everyone, uses it differently. I would say for you all and what I've learned about your vernacular, the point of that slide would be much more around the initiative point there, because for you all, strategy is your vision, especially as you use it in your strategic plan. And so really the intent behind that is, yes, that vision would not change, and so therefore what you have articulated in your strategic plan would remain. But the initiatives underneath, the programs underneath that are intended to work towards that vision, that's what a pivot might impact in terms of switching. So I'm glad that you asked for clarification.
Because we talked internally really about action steps for priorities. And so for me, my takeaway is like maybe our action steps change.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, with that being said, Mr. Larson, if you want to kick us off with health and safety.
And people feel free to pass and either.
Yeah.
It's not an assumption that you will all have questions about all of them.
Yeah, and if you don't this round, it's, feel free to pass, and as you hear from someone else, that may trigger you to, maybe ask another question, so.
Well, I do have something, and that's, this is a health and safety one, but when we got to engaging first-time instruction, we mentioned that we didn't have impact metrics because it was far out. So coming back to health and safety, I'm looking at the impact metrics for the COVID dashboard and the health mitigation strategies and all that. And I don't see an impact matrix, impact metric, I meant to say. And I guess what I'm wondering there is how would we even go about that? Because we know these things come and go in waves. We know we're seeing improvement right now. We may have, depending on how you count, either a third or a fourth or a fifth wave of this thing in the future, hopefully not, but we could. And then we would see things go to pieces and then get better again. And that's just the nature of the thing. So I guess, how would we measure whether what we're doing has an impact? And my concern here is it's really easy to keep doing a rain dance until someday it rains and say, aha, our rain dance brought rain. And I don't want to do that. So can you kind of steer me along on how our impacts would work? And that would be my question.
I think you really summarized the dilemma quite well. And whereas in the case of, like with personalized learning, an aspect of engaging first-time instruction, it is our intention to have ongoing conversations with that. In contrast, with health mitigation strategies, the sense is that there's so many intervening variables that we can implement practices that promote greater health than would have otherwise existed, or avoid more problems than would have otherwise existed without them. But it's in terms of the amount of it would be not reasonable to say, well, this will be the level of transmission or the number of positive cases, or we'll see a decrease, because there might be a decrease, but it could very well be from things unrelated to the health mitigation measures. So the intent is to focus on the fidelity and the effectiveness, including the consistency. We think that consistency is important, that we do need to stay focused on, so that there's greater consistency across schools, from day-to-day practices, but also including exclusion practices, for example, and that we've got consistency in that area as well.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Ms. Davis?
I don't have any questions at this
Okay.
moment.
Mr. Cottrell?
Just comments. I'm gonna stick to the I like, I wish, and I wanted, because I think that's what I'm supposed to do. What's that?
That's our reaction round?
Yeah. I like. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is if you want to wait, if you want to hold that comment and wait till our reaction round, because right now.
I'll still react with I like later. I'll make the comments now, because it was part of my word. All right, but health and safety, you know, what I like is how you talked about checkpoints along the way. And then that's, you know, with his question in my notes was checking that effectiveness, obviously along the way. I mean, right now in these times we plan and pivot. And Brian, thank you very much for helping with this and all you do with safety for the district as a whole. So thank you for collaborating and working with me. But yeah, so checking that effectiveness. I mean, right now, since last year, plan and pivot, it seems like that's all we've been doing, you know, nonstop. So I did like that a lot. And I think, I don't know if there's, oh, and the inclusion, the metrics with mental health resources, so important, you know, to have that in there for all students, especially when we get into even the special needs. But even average Joe and Jill in the classroom right now needs that extra resource there to help support that. So, not really questions, but my likes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Kutra. Mr. Bone.
So, maybe this is a reaction before we even get started, but I know every time we've discussed superintendent targets over the past several years, or at least since I've been on the board, it seems like the battle has always been to get a precise measurement of each thing we're actually holding the superintendent accountable for. And so if we're going to say students feel their campus district supports their mental well-being, well, how do we measure that? Is that through surveys? Is that through feedback? Is that through the number of parent complaints? And I think before we're going to put any of these into effect, we need to know what those measurements are and what the trend lines are leading up to them. Because I know sometimes in previous years we've set a number, which I think is not the approach that we're advocating here. But having a trend, but knowing what the trend is on that measurement beforehand to know if we're staying put or going up or going down, before we even vote on these, I think is very important. And I really just don't see that background in a lot of these. And so for the number of counselor requests and visits, we do have that trend line. And so I think if we're going to include that as a target, then I'd like to see what the trend, like what measurement we're going to use to show success or failure now, so that at the end of the year we can come back to it and see whether that trend line has moved in the right direction. But I guess other than that, I guess my question was on under effectiveness metrics for the COVID-19 dashboard, mitigation strategies being followed. First of all, I'd like to know how we're going to measure that. But also, isn't that a fidelity metric and not an effectiveness metric?
So you shared a bunch, so if we can try to break down some of those, Dr. Baird, if you can address some of the topics both in terms of the mental well-being measurements and the approach to consistency with mitigation strategies.
Sure. So you asked about the impact metrics for mental well-being. We can certainly address that with survey instruments. We have previous survey instruments, whether it's Youth Truth or climate surveys that we've done in the past that are similar, that we can still use. The fact that we can share all the data here, we'll still be able to bring the checkpoints, not the checkpoints, but the formal board review of where we are, those trends. I think of Mr. Sanchez years ago of asking, what are the trends? And
that one is a frustrating one specifically too, because it feels like every single time we come back to that, we use some different survey instrument. And so like we use Youth Truth one year, we use something else one year, and so we never actually get a trend line on that. It's just a snapshot every single year with a different set of questions. So can we just use whatever we did last year again, so that we at least start building a trend line?
The key is asking the same question with whatever we use, making sure we ask the same question. So that'll be one of my tasks that I'll take back, to look at the exact question that we asked last year. Now, trend for me is 3 points, but certainly movement. We can see that the movement is in the right direction. The question about the mitigation strategies, so the Fidelity metrics that we're using is the tiered system that are designed, and making sure that that tiered system is adhered to, designed to influence those changes. That effectiveness, the fact that we're using, and so you asked how we are going to measure those observations. We have individuals right now that are going to campuses in the last couple of weeks that have been going, for example, to look at what percentage of students are on the floor, for example, in kindergarten classrooms. Sorry, Holly. We're looking at in cafeterias, are the students spread out in social distancing, for example. And so we have a list on a form that we're going just to see, and based on those forms, we're able to, yes, look at Fidelity, because you are correct about that, but also, are we effectively implementing those strategies from the adults? And so we're able to have conversations with administrators and provide additional data to say, okay, here's what we're seeing at other campuses. We believe this is an effective mitigation strategy, and either we're seeing it or we're not seeing it, and this is how it can be improved.
Okay, thanks.
Dr. DuPont?
To what extent were social and emotional learning type issues included as part of the discussion under the effectiveness metrics? Because those are, the ones that I see here are all more kind of mental health and counselor related versus what's happening in classrooms, and like the trauma-informed training that happened last year, and how, were those things discussed as a piece of that?
Mr. Palazzi can chime in, but what I will say is that even though it wasn't necessarily listed here, that doesn't mean we stopped the trauma-informed training. One, it's in statute now that we have provided, but we were ahead of that statute. So like Dr. McIntosh mentioned, this doesn't limit what we're doing on our campuses. It just raises to the level of where we are of need in our current environment. And it doesn't minimize the need either. But so that trauma-informed instruction, it's still occurring. It's still in our campuses. And I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
The sprint team very much was going back and forth on how to word that, knowing that from 2 years ago, moving forward, we're going to see issues that need to be addressed. And so to answer your question, yes, the social emotional was spoken about, and the thought was including it in that. It wasn't just, it's just going to be mental health. It's the resources that we have that we're already, we have those still. And addressing them through the counseling department, through other avenues. So it was not, but they were stuck on how to word it. Do we want to just word it mental health? Do we want to word it just social emotional? So that conversation was an integral part of that entire initiative.
Thank you.
Mr. Hanks?
Mr. Wellesley, just a kind of a follow-up to that one, because I had written down a question, when we say numbers of counselor requested, are we referring to social emotional counseling, or are we considering academic counseling as part of that metric? It truly is social emotional. I just wanted to be sure, because I think that's important as we look at that.
And we're fortunate to have the one and only Ms. Dave West in here.
I don't know about all that, but thank you. So when we measure a lot of different things in our office visits. Sometimes it starts as academic, so the counselor does note that, but then it can move into a personal issue, so they can actually select different reasons. So that's some of the things that we look for trends in that as well. So it can be a bit of both, I think. Did you have a follow-up question? Did I address it?
I guess just making sure, I don't know that process, but I think transitioning from an academic intake to a social, emotional, or mental health, I guess, I would assume that all that's done seamlessly and that there would be no confusion, or we wouldn't miss students who were.
Like, a few years ago with our safety audit, safety meetings and everything, we did implement our mental health check-in. So before we even do any kind of academic conferencing or a student even walks into a counseling office, but in particular with those academic meetings that we have with all the 6th through 12th graders, we do the mental health check-in with them. And if at any point in time, anything comes as a red flag, it's immediately changed. Like the academic is tabled and they take care of whatever the need of the student is. So that's part of that mental health check-in that we do with our students as well. And we have implemented the mental health check-in like K. They've done an amazing job of scaffolding it, so we have it from K all the way up to 12th grade now. So that's our gauge onto which direction we go.
Thank you, that's helpful. And then I guess just the last question is, and I think to Mr. Bowen's comment about, some context for what we would see as improvement or growth or changes, knowing what direction it's going or the trends, the sooner that we could see what that is. If today we don't know absolutely what that's going to be, but if we know not a year from now, a month from now, 4 weeks, 6 weeks from now, this is how things are coming together that we are going to be looking at intentionally as we tie back to the targets, especially because some of them will happen very quickly, is just so we understand when we see a Friday report or when we see a board packet, just so we have a sense of where should we focus our attention and how clear is it that things are trending the way we would want them to, based on what you all are sharing and whatever tools and data we're using. I do think it's helpful because there have been instances where we get to the end of the year and then we start to talk about it and then we sometimes reflect, oh, we didn't have it or we didn't capture it, so to what extent we do that would be helpful.
Right. Your question is spot on, which is the purpose of the checkpoints, to make sure that we don't just get to the end of the year and all of a sudden we realize, oh, that's not exactly what we're looking for. So those checkpoints along the way, and then the formal board updates will lend itself to looking at the trends and the directions that we're headed during the year.
So I will ask my two, well, actually one was basically a copy. Mr. Bowen kind of beat me to the punch on the mitigation strategies. How are we going to, measure the effectiveness of it? But my second question, I can remember years ago when we brought Tony on board and PBIS, how are we going to tie that into, mental health? Because I think that that's a still developing, area, and it kind of ties in with behavior. Kids will lash out if they don't feel secure and things of that nature. So I would like to see us somehow incorporate Tony's in it. And I know when we went from like his first year, for example, and then his second year, we were able to say, okay, well, gosh, he had over 600 family touch points. So that was a measurable, but I wonder what that is, because now he's gotten some help, right? But I feel that some of our community does not realize that his office, is there. So that's kind of my, as it relates to health and safety.
We certainly have that data, and my recent conversation with Mr. Dowell is that their processes are continuing to evolve and get even better. So even, for example, going to classrooms with 6 students, in the past it was difficult to look at the data for only 6 students of behavioral outbursts, for example. And with Christina and Tally there now, they have a cleaner process that they're actually helping teachers in those smaller classrooms. So yes, we'll have that data to additionally support this.
Okay. And then I'll run back through, does anybody have anything else they wanted to add? based on our conversations or anything? So I guess we will move on to literacy and development.
Any questions on that?
Why don't I go ahead and kick us off? That way we'll end up with Mr. Larson. My question when it came to literacy and development is how are we going to capture our ESL students and also our special ed students? Like how are we going to incorporate them, into literacy development?
I'm so glad you asked, and I'm sorry that I didn't highlight that, all the other highlights previously. But
Don't shortchange me.
So, so for the BAS assessment, know that we have the complement to that in Spanish. And so we're typically assessing our language learners in both English and in Spanish to determine dominance as well as their progression in reading. So that's a piece there. Certainly all of our students are also, in all of our so that's one thing on the assessment. And certainly our students that receive special services receive that assessment as well. But more importantly, to the fidelity point and to the effectiveness metrics, change of adult behavior. All of our coordinators, our district level personnel, as well as our campus level personnel that are working with special needs students or working with language learners, they're all involved in the Science of Teaching Reading Institute. We front loaded them this year so that we could capitalize on that knowledge to infuse all of the instruction. So that those are pieces that are in place on both the instruction side, the adult learner, as well as assessing on the student side.
And if I could add to that too, there is a biliteracy track. I thought that's where you were going with the Reading Academies. So our bilingual or dual language teachers will be in the biliteracy track and led by a bilingual instructional coach. But just to add to
Well,
that.
even knowing, I didn't know, I learned something new today. I didn't know BAS was in Spanish. So
Yes,
that's
SEL. Yes,
fantastic.
it's called SEL, so yes.
Yeah, great. Mr. Sanchez?
Only, I guess, question would be, knowing that our focus is on that wave one group, I think I'm looking at the right one.
That's personalized learning.
Oh, personalized, I'm sorry, scratch that. So looking at the K-1, I think in your comments, Holly, you mentioned K-12.
Yes.
I think when you were talking through it, and so I quickly looked and I was like, oh, did that change? But then it still says K-1. I wondered from a literacy standpoint, our continued focus across all of our grade levels and what we'll learn. I think what you said was as we transition beyond K-1, we'll do incremental grades as we increase. And I'm just wondering what that looks like for students who are already in our pipeline and how quickly we can provide
Great question.
level of assistance for them.
Great question. As far as the target specifically, lifting that up is narrowly focused to that K-1 piece on that metric portion. Yet the work of one of our action steps is certainly, and our work continues to be certainly pre-K-12. And so some of the specific pieces and the action steps of the district teams and the PLCs that even Dr. Silva mentioned, as well as the campus PLCs, that will impact beyond that K-1, the K-1 level. So there's a lot, there's work that's going to continue on beyond this target, but we're trying to be tight and focused on that piece for K-1 this year.
Dr. Dupont?
Yes, I have a few specific questions about the assessments, and I'll try to group them all together. As I understand it, so the BAS is given to everybody in K2, everybody in 3 through 6th or 7th, or just the?
Only identified students showing need.
Okay, and then the new RAPS is only going to be for the low level learners.
That is going to be for incoming 7th graders that were not successful in 6th grade in the reading assessment.
So we're not successful on STAR in sixth grade. Okay, that's all related to the assessments, I guess. And the resource, I'll group it in the resources that the packet that you showed. Are the resources being developed only for pre-K 1, or those are for all levels?
For all, and that's, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is the part that's going to support that entire system as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at these targets, I think that they kind of answered the objection I had in the previous section. I mean, 95% of K-1 teachers participating in reading academies is an excellent target. That's very measurable. Resources created and revised, not as much, but I think that's kind of an is it done or is it not type thing. But again, classroom observation data, how is that evaluated? How is that measured? I mean, is there a rubric that is being gone through, and can we and do we kind of get a percentage or a score at the end of that to set a target to?
I can definitely, we're definitely have a tool to, and a rubric to look through, and yes, I'm trying to think of how to bring that back to share it up to a level to you. That's something that, it's a great question, and a piece that I need to continue to work on.
And then on BAS, is this the same assessment that we've done in previous years? And so are we going to have enough data to form a trend line?
I am excited to share with you that we are not changing the BAS assessment, and so we will have, I know that yearning for an apple to an apple, we will have that same piece this year.
Okay.
In addition, and there's more that we're implementing within Amplify data, so some of that we'll have some new data to supplement in different ways.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
yes, we'll have some comparative data that.
So I guess my request on that one then would be, as these take final form for us to approve, can we have the previous year data just so that we know what we're going to be compared to?
Yes, sir.
Thanks.
Mr. Contrell?
No, Mr. Bowen, my question was the measurability of the classroom data, how you go about getting that.
Ms. Vick?
I have no questions.
All right. Mr. Larson?
Maybe this is just because I'm the new guy, but how did we land? This implies that the BAS is the only tool we're using to measure, the impact. And how did we land on that?
That is a great question. So in the science teacher in reading, there are assessments that are approved by the state. That is one lens that we look through. And additionally, we look at what is research-based and gives us the strongest outcome for instruction into the classroom. And so we've surveyed many assessments, several different assessments, and look at the new ones that are proposed each year, actually, to determine what we feel and what we know to be from based on research and application to be the most useful. We've tried piloting additional assessments in the past as they've come out. To see if they would take the place in efficiency or in output effectiveness. And we're maintaining, and it's good to have an assessment that we can use year to year. We've continued on with this assessment. Amplify is new, so it's not, this is the one assessment that gives us the strongest indicator of reading fluency and reading comprehension. And we feel like it's the strongest measure of a child's progress in our classrooms and best matched for our instruction. But the Amplify and the in-class data that we're now using is, we've taken portions of this BAS test away and we've started using Amplify, this new assessment for some of the portions that we previously used in the BAS assessment. So it has evolved over time to, I know, the frustration somewhat to measure year to year, to have that clean measure, but we'll be able to pull out the components that to report back to you on the BAS and to now scaffold to with the Amplify.
So STAR starts measuring reading at grade 3, right?
STAR does start measuring at grade 3. That is an accurate statement.
So is there any way to correlate what's going on with BAS and this other new one with STAR and make sense of all that?
We do look at that every year. The exciting thing about STAR is you never know what it's going to assess or to, out of all of the, it doesn't seem like much, but the art of reading is a complex portion. So which portion will they lift up to assess with 2 questions? And to what degree will we actually know that about a reader's life? So we look at the BAS levels of students as well as STAR data and the predictability in that. And we can tell the stronger we are in BAS, the stronger certainly they're going to score in STAR, but the STAR, it is an interesting data point for us to use. And it's not always the best predictor of a strong reader.
Is it fair to say that the assessments we're using in-house are more comprehensive?
They are, certainly, and they are not, and the assessment that we're using, they're actually research-based. They are, it is out of Ohio State, and they're used by a very well-researched and found literacy foundation. So they're not internally created. For you to know that that is not based on our measure by any means. It's nationally, it has been tested and used and supported.
Thanks.
So, and I'll just comment where a lot of districts maybe across the country will use NEA or something like that. We use BAS, but we're trying to ensure that our students will be competitive, not just in Texas, but if they go to Harvard, if they go to MIT, wherever they go, so.
Good.
Just kind of helps.
We can also, I can share a little background on, just, it's a term that we use often, and so I know that might be something that.
But that's a great question, very good question. Mr. Larson, was there anything else anybody wanted to add? Dr. DuPont?
Around the professional learning communities, I don't know if I'm asking this just at the secondary level, but are those, I think that those are not just in core classes, that they're across the board, used by everybody, and including fine arts and electives and places like that. And so then my other question is, for things like AP classes and magnet schools and things, do the professional learning communities go across schools?
So if we're on literacy development, there's a reference to the PLCs and the effectiveness metric. My understanding is that this is focused particularly on K1, and the broader one, as part of engaging first-time instruction, references PLCs more broadly.
Transition, yes.
Okay. I did ask it for the purpose too of seeing the extension of this target, the application in the secondary level. So that was part of the intent of my question. But thank you.
Is that it? And anybody else have anything? Okay. We will move on to Mr. Larson. If you want to start us off with engaging first-time instruction.
I think I'll pass for this. I might have something for this.
Okay. Ms. Davis?
Yeah, I'll pass too.
Okay. Mr. Cottrell?
Just one, I'll make it a question if y'all like it. The word effectiveness used multiple times, Dr. Silva, and effectiveness of the instruction specifically, that being measurable. I guess that's something that you'll be able to provide, right, as far as the effectiveness of that instruction.
I'm looking for effectiveness, I'm sorry. Are you talking about the classroom walkthrough data?
So when you were, when you were talking about the PLCs, then you referenced and said that they would be intentional, and then measure the effectiveness of the instruction. So.
I got you, just in what I
Yeah,
said. Okay,
yeah.
I thought I was.
I wrote down
looking for it.
everything you said.
Okay.
I put
You know,
quotes and everything.
our measure for the PLC work is to do some survey data with teachers and campus administrators to ask them about how they are feeling about their effectiveness in the PLC in using data. So the specific piece of the PLC that sort of elevates it to a higher level is the use of student data to plan instruction. We start with kind of coming together and planning and identifying essential standards, and then we want them to develop common assessments, so they're all giving the same test, so we can see, are we all learning at what level are we learning? And then the use of that data to plan the next instruction, that's really the specific piece. The effectiveness piece that we're looking for is, do teachers feel equipped to develop a common assessment, administer the common assessment, and get that data back to say, okay, now what do I do with it, and plan that together collaboratively. So those are some of the sort of higher level pieces of PLC development. So I guess I say they're effectively working as a PLC if they're doing those sort of the deeper work of creating common assessments, analyzing that data, and then planning next instruction.
So that, analyzing that data and determining from there. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Mr. Vaughn?
Yeah, I think my comment's kind of the same as a lot of these. Like, I'd just like to kind of know what, and if you could even include maybe a copy of it, like what rubric is being used to evaluate as you do these classroom walkthroughs, whether the target is being adhered to, and sort of how is that being assessed, and what percentage are we shooting for in order to determine success. I think is, because again, at the end of the day, we have to come back in May or at the end of the year and determine whether we succeeded. And we should decide ahead of time whether 75% is success or 99% or whatever we want to say. And I think trying to decide that after the fact without setting a goal ahead of time is, I almost think it invites conflict, because people are going to disagree after the fact whether we succeeded or not. And so I think if we can decide that up front, then we're all on the same page.
I can actually help add some clarity there around that, specifically to the Wave 1 schools that we'll be working with, that we'll actually do a baseline learning walk with them, a walkthrough where there will be a standardized tool that we use to collect observational data that is grounded in our work across the country, and we do some sort of readiness assessment based on that baseline learning walk. And then there are additional learning walks throughout the school year with the same instrument, the same kind of normed checkpoints there, and what we want to see is growth around each of those indicators. There's a continuum for each of our components of personalized learning, and what we want to see is percentages of teachers growing across that continuum. And so happy to share those materials, and that'll be stuff we can report out on as we go.
Absolutely, and I think that definitely answers the question. So I just kind of like to know what those instruments are and how they'll be used.
All right, Dr. Dupont.
I'm trying to figure out how to pull all the thoughts together into one or two questions. I'll ask this first. The first metric there is obviously related to Wave 1 and the Personalized Learning Initiative. Is the second metric there intended to apply to all levels, K through 12? Okay. And
You mean in terms of the PLCs? Okay.
that we're actually going to be
Pre-K to 12.
looking at data from all levels.
And I would compare this to the health and safety one, where they're complementary rows. I mean, these relate, but they're distinct, and they are grouped intentionally under engagement first-time instruction.
Dr. Vaughn, on the combined superintendent targets, it's probably a little bit easier to see because the rows are more clearly defined, goes across, as opposed to some that are merged.
Okay, and then I guess within that, within the Way One and the Personalized Learning Initiative, I guess I'm just looking for more, and not right now and today, but more clarification on the definition of what we're defining as personalized learning and how we're going forward with that and what that means. Because I think in this district, we have a lot of efforts going on at all levels that are different personalized learning initiatives. And so obviously this is something specific of a whole effort that's going forward, but I think it all needs to be very well defined as we go forward in this. Otherwise, because it means different things to different people, and just so that we know what we're measuring to looking for. I think that's going to be important. And I know that wasn't framed as a question.
My question, once again, is how do we measure? My second question, I guess, kind of goes with our motto for the year, and that was Ignite Learning for All. How do we tie, you know, the engaging first-time instruction with that motto? You understand what I'm saying?
Definitely.
So how do we get those two to kind of mesh, and what's the measurable? Is it going to be PLCs? Is it just going to be for staff, you know, or is it going to be for our students as well? Or are they going to be grouped into that?
I don't see that as an individual metric for any one of these. Igniting Learning for All, for me, encompasses the work that we do in health mitigation so that students can focus on teaching, on the learning, and teachers can focus on teaching. It also aligns to the literacy development, igniting that science of reading that teachers will use to ignite that passion for reading, and students enjoy that. It ties into engaging first-time instruction. And that is to ignite learning for all is students should be engaged and wanting to participate in that learning process if teachers make that first-time learning engaging, and they do that through professional learning communities. And personalized learning only enhances that at the elementary level, those 9 schools, 10 schools, it's part of that professional learning community that they focus on that professional learning, personalized learning, to ignite that learning. So it's embedded and woven in throughout.
So I think that's how maybe Dr. DuPont, how maybe those two mesh, I guess. But now it's what's going to be the measurable, right?
They do mesh. A lot of our targets, as they should, if we have one mission statement and one strategic plan, and so you'll see intermingling between many of the targets. And so yes, even our work together was how do we pull it out and separate it enough to where we have distinct superintendent targets.
Okay.
That's part of the work.
Okay. And I didn't have anything else, I guess, as I go back around. Dr. DuPont, did you have anything else that you wanted to? I know you're grappling with it.
I'm going to turn it into a reaction.
Okay, all right. So we'll turn it into a reaction, and then I guess I'll start us off with budget planning. So we'll move to budget planning, and my question, well, really, I didn't have anything. I just wanted to say that, you know, being on the board for a while and watching, you know, how our finance department works and everything like that, I think that, you know, we're in good hands. I know the challenges that we're going to be faced with in terms of funding and things of that nature coming down the line, but I know that we're creative and that we're always looking, you know, for that balance between, you know, being able to provide the resources and the programs for our students
And then juggling that with, taxpayer concerns and things of that nature. So, I didn't really have a comment. I think that it's interesting because I know that there's a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan, a 7-year plan, and that's how far out we look. So, I don't know if there's a way to broadcast that so people know that, because I think people just assume that we just roll into, 2022 and just, let's look at what's going on, and they don't know that we looked at this 5 years ago, so.
My only question for this one is, how does this drive something different than what is already being done relative to budget planning?
On the expenditure side, we need to look at every single area that we're spending money, every single program that we're spending money on, to see if those are effective. And so we've got a group here that analyzes the effectiveness of all our programs. We've got an internal auditor that can help us analyze whether we're being effective in our transportation department, as we've done a lot over the past few years. I'm pretty confident we're doing well there, but certainly in maintenance and operations everywhere else. So we can find pockets or areas where we might be able to trim around the edges, because we can't, we got to do this surgically. We got to trim around the edges. We can't go in and just lop off huge areas of our district and expect to continue with the excellence we have in the instruction. And on the revenue side, there's some revenue options we need to look at. I mean, that we can't count on the state to bail us out all the time. And so, or in the future, I don't think they've had there's a philosophy in Austin that we've already got too much money, right? So we've got to look at internal ways where we can look at revenue options that we can maybe tap into in the future. And those things would be phased in over time. We can't just do everything all at once and on the revenue side either. We've got to look at when the timing would be for those types of things.
And I guess what I would add to it as well is it's not so much work that's different than what's occurred in the past, but it's really an acceleration of those efforts and an intensification of those efforts, recognizing, it's been an effective, good practice for years to have a multi-year budget forecast, and now we're that much closer to FY 25 with where the state funding is by that point really fallen off in comparison to where it is now. And so it's not so much that it's new, but it needs to be stepped up because we're that much closer to FY 25.
Mr. Bowen?
So I really like this section, as you probably predicted. But for the effectiveness metric, you could read the 20% of capital or contingency funds in any given fiscal year as allowing minus 20%, minus 20%, minus 20%. And I don't think we would be really happy if that occurred. Maybe a better way to phrase this target would be to always maintain a 5-year projection that when you look at the entire 5-year projection, we don't spend more than a certain amount of the capital fund. And it would be higher than 20%. But I think we would like to get to the point where our 5-year outlook is highly sustainable. And so maybe the goal is not that any given year is less than 20%, but maybe a 5-year projection is less than 30% or 40% or something. And we can decide on what a reasonable target is. And then that way, that frame kind of always moves with us as we go from year to year. And that last year is going to be the most negative one. It may alone even be higher than 20%, but the 5-year outlook is more sustainable. And so we're kind of always like improving that 5th year because another year is coming.
Mr. Cottrell?
Maybe not a question, but a thought, maybe a question too. Back in January, February, we had a policy meeting. We talked about this trimming you know, there was gonna be a need. We see what's coming in the future and all that, and the need for trimming. So maybe the question is being able to kind of present the data showing programs, you know, like you mentioned, the effectiveness of existing programs and where we're trimming. So if there's something data-wise that we could look at with some of those programs, because I remember our discussion back then was, you've got 40,000 students, you've got this program that's been around for 10 years, maybe now you've kind of let it run its course and then it's not really engaging anymore, or the teacher who brought the program on isn't even in the district anymore. So maybe sharing some data like that so we can show, and this kind of goes back to some of the community, kind of how fiscal responsible we're being. Look, this program took its course, we're, you know, trimming this program for this reason, fiscal mindfulness, and then, you know, so that, you know, we're actively showing what we're doing with these kind of programs. So I don't know if that's a question, but.
Can I back up to a comment on that?
Yeah.
Because I know back when the original curriculum audit was done, I don't remember exactly what year that was, one of the recommendations that the district didn't move forward with was to move to a program-based budget instead of a department-based budget like we have now. And so maybe something like that needs to be part of the larger conversation, or maybe we don't have a program-based budget, but we do present more detail about within departments how much is going to particular programs that we've identified. So as we kind of do program review and identify programs, we can see how much spending is attached to each one. And that would help drive decision making.
I would just, along, if you're presenting that information, effectiveness of the program too. I mean, just so it's not just a decision based on cost, but, you know, some things may cost more and be extremely effective, or maybe they cost very little but be very effective as well. So just that mindfulness.
And, you know, I want to emphasize, this is not just instructional programs, it's
Correct.
operational programs, it's everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, college career, all that.
Could be anything.
Ms. Davis?
We're still in the questions part, right?
Yes.
I have no questions.
Okay. Mr. Larson?
Yeah, so coming all the way over to the Fidelity, we talked a little bit about looking for places to cut and using a scalpel instead of an axe and that kind of thing. Is there any kind of process, a formal kind of thing in place to identify programs or initiatives to sunset? Or is that done just by going through line item by line item and, you know, just taking a look at it? How do we go about that?
So one of my goals / tasks, I don't want to call it official goal, but responsibilities is to renew and reinvigorate our program evaluations. Bring that process back up. We have an outstanding Executive Director of Assessment Evaluation, and so we've already had conversations about compiling a list of programs that we're aware of, and then the next step is to determine additional programs that campuses might be using that we might not be aware of, but we should be. And then also I'll send that out for the board to provide any feedback on programs that you might be aware of based on what you see on that list. So that process of program evaluation, looking to renew and reinvigorate again. That process is a good process to measure including the Fidelity effectiveness and impact and return on investment. There's a financial portion that's always included at the end of the program evaluations, and now that I'm in this role, I can make sure that the evaluations are done according to my expectations.
Anybody have anything else? Did you have?
Not on this one.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we will move to the reaction portion. So, Mr. Cottrell, you should be all over this one. This is where, there you go. This is where, you know,
just feel free, regardless of what the target is. To make it easy, one of the comments that I'll make is, I can remember a couple of years ago, when at least 4 of us, our superintendent at the time had 21, was it 21 targets? Something like that, roughly. And so, to be able to kind of narrow it down to 4 and then have some measurables within those 4 is kind of refreshing. And it won't cause you to turn your hair any more grayer.
That's not possible.
But, so that's one of the comments that I'll make just to start us off, that I kind of like this because it, narrows it down and kind of gives some focus to what the targets are. So, and then I guess I'll start with Mr. Sanchez.
Sure. So, I would just say I like that as a district we continue to strive on progression with recognition that ultimately this is a journey. I do probably place more emphasis on the flag because I think if we don't see the flag, we're more likely to lose folks if they don't have a sense of, are we on the right path? Are we close? Is it still a long ways? And so I think ultimately that's just what I would share. So, but I do appreciate
Dr. Dumont.
I guess for my first one, I have to jump up to a very high level. And I'm going to somehow pose this in a positive way too. But I have concern that and maybe it's because I don't understand it, about how to use this along with, I guess, how we're using the 3 concentric circles and superintendent targets as part of it, to help to give the board a tool to align the district around activities, including the campuses, relative to the strategic plan. At a high level, I think I've always looked at the superintendent targets as a way to drive all the action that's happening throughout the district. And I think it's because, and maybe it is because it's a smaller number of targets, and maybe because some of them are very targeted within themselves to certain areas, but my concern is around every campus not being able to relate to enough within these targets that they can make things actionable, or that they misunderstand and think, well, that doesn't apply to me, so I don't need to work on that one. So, and I know there's a lot wrapped up into it, and Dr. McIntosh at our workshop in July used the words to have an intentional engagement strategy to be able to make it all happen. And so I guess for me, and maybe it's an understanding thing, is I don't see that right now. And so I feel lost in that piece of it, that there's not, how are we going to, if this was our main tool for getting all the campuses to do their thing and for getting parents and everybody involved at that level, how did we do that? Being able to still somehow pull in CBAS and the strategic plan and the superintendent targets. So that's, I hope I stated it well.
Is there a comment around the reaction, or just let the reaction flow?
Let the reaction flow. We reflect at the end.
Mr. Bone?
So I guess my reaction is it sounds nice to have 4 targets, but I think what we really have here is 16 targets, because there are 16 different boxes that have something in them, and every single one of those needs to be measured. And I think what I've asked for in the past on targets is some sort of measurement or statement of our current status, and then at the checkpoint, what do we expect our status to be? So mental health resources and supports for students exist at each campus. What is our status on that now? What is our status going to be in November, and what do we expect to have changed in between those 2 points? And that's a target. And when we get to November, then we can evaluate, are we where we wanted, like, we're in September now, are we where we wanted to be in September now that it's November? And so I think for every single one of these, we need something like that. What is our measurement? What is our current status? What do we expect our future status to be? And my guess is when you go about developing those, on some of these, you may find that our current status is where we want to be. I mean, a tiered system of mitigation strategies for COVID. We already have that. I don't think we're expecting it to be much different in November. So maybe that doesn't need to be a target. Maybe we just say that that's a statement of something we've already done that contributes to this effort, and we leave it at that. But I think as this exists now, I don't know that I'm ready to vote on it next week, because a lot of that context is still needed. Because otherwise, when we get to November and March and the dates listed in here, we're not going to be able to demonstrate how much things have changed because we don't have previously existing information of our current status, at least not that's been shared as part of the targets. So that's kind of how I think about it now. But yeah, it's about measurability, what is our current status, and how do we tell that we've made a change when the date gets there.
Thank you. Mr. Cottrell?
So are we supposed to, I wish,
I
wonder? No, you know, me being new here, new to the board and everything, I like all of this. I like what I see. I like words you use like intentional. I think it's very important. You know, I see collaboration, I see comments of community partnerships, inclusiveness. You talk about the budget and, you know, in inviting a group to, you know, give some assistance on trying to figure out the best route forward. So from my beginning standpoint, I do like it. I do understand those that have been here longer, you know, have more questions, you know, and I think that it's good to have the metrics, and it's important that we have the data that supports, you know, the effectiveness of everything you're doing. And then just for, I wonder how we compare to other districts our size and with our budget, and what a breakdown like that looks like. Because I know when we're talking about so many different things, tax rates, things like that, we're comparing ourselves to close, you know, nearby school districts, but a district that's 40,000 students with a $370 million budget, and what their budget looks like, and you know how many programs they have, and that may be a way for us to measure CCISD in a very apples to apples kind of scenario, if there's one out there. So that's it. I appreciate it. Y'all did great. Thank y'all. Thank you.
Ms. Davis.
Whew, okay, I'm gonna say I wonder. I wasn't in superintendent's targets last year. These here board reflection and feedback protocols, very, very specific, very detailed. We'll ask one question. There is no discussion, things like that. That's, to me, that's very specific. And to me, this is very vague. As some said, there's no rubric that we can make the decision on. I'm in a state of confusion, I have to say, because I don't know how to vote on something that I don't know how to quantify. Use it by how students feel their mental well-being is being supported. To me, that's too opaque. I need something a lot more specific. So I think I'll just leave it at that. I'm confused. Thank you.
Mr. Larson.
So, I was thinking quite a bit about what Mr. Bellman had to say, and that brought me back to the chart on page 10, where we kind of, the flow chart where we walk through how does this affect this, and then how does that affect that, and so forth, and just walking through. And that's why we have 16 targets instead of just 4, is because, you know, I personally, I don't approach it exactly the way he does, and I'm much more focused on the bottom line. Where do we get to? How does this help our students? How does this make us a more effective district? But it's not really fair to evaluate our superintendent just on that, And I liken this to, for lack of a better analogy, oil exploration. When you start trying to develop that resource, you start with your geologist, right? And they sit down with computer models and they figure out, well, where should we drill the hole? And that's your first step here. And then you turn it over to the production team and they go out and they try to set up their oil rig and they hire the best people to get that hole dug and everything, and that's your second step. And then what comes out of the ground is your third step, right? So it's not really fair to evaluate the superintendent on just the last thing, even though that's what we all care about. And that's why we have all these other targets. Now, looking over all these other targets and just seeing the whole thing, I think I am with Scott in thinking that I'm not sure I'm ready to vote on this yet. And so then my concern becomes, well, I'm asking for more development, right? If I'm saying I'm not ready to vote on it next week, but that can be overdone. We can't get paralyzed and just analyzing this stuff and coming up with more and more and better. We need to eventually say, well, this is good enough and this is what we're going to hit. I don't know when we get to that point. I don't know when we have to cut it off and say, hey, this is as good as it's going to get. Let's just run with this plan and go with it. But so I don't have an answer for you. But I can tell you, it feels like we should do a little more development. And the point is very well taken on benchmarking against other districts. Just specifically, the impact metric for the COVID, that's the first thing that popped into my mind is, can't we get some kind of feel for that by benchmarking against other districts? I don't know the answer to that. That's something I would think about, and something, if I had the time and resources, I would spend a little bit of them looking at that and see if maybe we can come up with something. All right.
And I know that, and kudos to Mr. Cottrell, Ms. Davis, and Mr. Larson, since this is their first time going through this process. The feedback and just some of the things that you guys see. I know we've always talked about measurables, and having access to data is another one. Mr. Bowen, you brought up a pretty good point, and I'll just use the COVID mitigation, strategies. Yes, we've developed a tiered approach, so maybe where does that take us to? Are we going to come up with a emergency citizens committee, for example, maybe not a big safety committee, but maybe just a 10-person, whether that's health professionals, whether that's, police, whether that's whomever, but maybe a quick committee that can confer or something like that. I don't know, but I think the theme that I'm hearing is, we want some measurables, maybe some meat and potatoes behind the bowl,
I think my very quick comment would be, I would like to know on each of these 16 targets, a definition of our current state. And it doesn't have to be super involved. It doesn't have to be the exact measurement we're going to use at the end. But I would just like, for every single one of these, if we're going to, if the goal is to improve, then we need to know what we're improving against. And we need to know it before we commit to improving on it. And so and maybe the current state in some of these is nothing. Like, this is a program that hasn't been implemented yet, and so we're proposing implementation. But I think a definition of current state for all of these is something we need before we can vote on it. And what we may find when we start evaluating that is that in some of them, we're already pretty close to where we want to be, and it doesn't need to be a target. But that would be something that would come out of that analysis. The definition of current state, I think, is imperative for all of these.
Mr. President, could I forgot one of my I wonder statements, and it's pretty important to me. So the implication is, I guess, that the way that the superintendent's targets were determined in the past was rigid and inflexible. And that I guess I wondered if that were the case. I mean, why is there a design change needed if I wonder if that process didn't work. And if this is too obtuse, if this is too open-ended, that's just simply what's going on in my head, thanks.
I do another thing related to that. I actually do have a few I like statements that I'd like to get into, and maybe I'll do those second, I don't know. But I do want to say something relative to the data, because I made charts and I want to be able to show them, or whatever it is. But I go back to this picture that we talked about last year during strategic planning, when we talked about the purpose of a strategic plan. So you have some ongoing student, so this is student performance, this is time. You have some kind of student performance that you're going to keep, ideally, you're going to keep going along at some level if you do nothing. And then, but if you implement your strategic plan, if you've done well, you're going to have this other line going up. And so you're going to get some gains, and if you go through time, you're going to be at a higher position than you would have been if you had just stayed still. So we talked about that a lot, but to me, what's happening right now too, is this added dotted line that's going down. So this is what we're being told, that somehow there's some performance that's going down, right, because of COVID, some COVID gap, or that performance is not where it was. And actually, our discussion last year, Mr. Sanchez, you too, we had a lot of discussion around how do we know. A lot of times in our superintendent targets, we were trying to measure that increase, and it was assuming that we know that this is happening, that we're going to sustain this performance. And we kept asking for what are measures that we can show we are sustaining this performance, and it is moving along that way. So for me, what's added in right now is that there's this dotted line going downward in some areas that has to do with COVID and what people are calling a COVID gap. And so now we somehow need to make up that COVID gap, and then also we want to get what's happening off of our strategic plan too, and that performance. And so I guess for me, part of the whole data issue and all of this is, do we have the information that we'll be able to do this, that the board will be able to see this at the end of the year? Because I know that that's what our parents and students are going to be interested in. Have there been gains made? Is there growth across everybody? So for me, that sums up the whole data issue, or what I'm looking at. And then let me just go, because there's some, I want to do some like statements. I like in the health and safety, I like the focus on the consistent implementation of policies and protocols, because I think this is a huge area for us and that we need to keep working on it. So I love that that's in there. I do, I don't know that word's the right word. I want to make sure that there's a focus on the SEL issues that the district has ramped up over the last couple of years. There was in the workshop in July, there was a whole category labeled student connection category, which doesn't show up in any of these, but I think it's inherent in many of these. So I want to be sure that we don't lose that piece of it, and what's happening in individual classrooms too, from an SEL perspective, and around the area of relationships between everybody. And the literacy one, I guess this one was more for, is there a way for I wonder if there's a way for the learning progressions too to be used at the secondary level for things that we have done, like for 6th and 7th graders with the learning progressions that we already have done. And in engaging first-time instruction, Dr. Silva, I loved your discussion about talking about personalized learning and choice in the 3 areas. I think that's beautiful, and I think if more people would understand what is trying to be accomplished with those 3 things, so I think that's absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
And I'll just leave it at that. Something beautiful.
Thank you, Dr. DuPont.
So we appreciate the feedback. What we're going to do is regroup before responding and determining next steps. Anything else?
Nope. I
Okay.
was afraid we would start to, but.
No, I'm good.
Um,
I did my last statement.
And so, we obviously we're moving forward with the year. We're meeting with administrators on Tuesday of next week, for example. Even though the board has not taken action on particular superintendent targets in terms of how they're expressed, we know the priority areas. So we're moving forward with asking them. So really, the way the strategic action and superintendent targets work is that they, in terms of influencing behavior on campuses and throughout the district, is by sharing information with them. And in this case, it's both the strategic plan generally, but also the superintendent targets. So we'll proceed with that, and it will start further influencing, and even just the articulation of priority areas before the school year started influences district and school level actions. And so that process will continue, even as we work with the board in terms of formal approval. The last year, I think the formal approval was relatively late, late in the calendar year for the school year, much of the school year passed. And so we'll proceed, and then we'll work with the board in terms of next steps with articulated targets that you can consider for approval.
And I assume that everybody got their like statements, their reactions, everything. Pretty good. Well, with that being said, did we want to give staff a chance?
Yeah, I'll do one more.
Okay.
Thank you all for all the work that was done
Yes,
and put into
definitely.
this, because I know there was a huge amount in July, and then I know that you've done a whole bunch of work between July and now. So, and I think we're in many places with the whole data issue. You know, we do this every single year. For the 8 years that I've been sitting on this board, every year we're looking for better defined measures and metrics to show growth and to show what's actually happening. So I don't think that's unusual. And so I think it's great the work that's happening within each one of those. And I think the board is always pushing for better defined data, and we'll get to it because we always do, and then get some good results things out of that. So thank you all.
Well, I just wanted to echo those sentiments too. Thank you once again to all the presenters, Dr. Silva, Dr. Bayard, Dr. Williams, Paul, everyone who else did I forget? Holly. Thank you for, presenting and representing your, that content area. And I guess, we'll do some more reflection, and I will ask that if you have any additional questions, please forward those as quickly as possible so we can get those to administration, and maybe they can, do some more digging or something like that. If there's anything that, as you're going home or as you're, tonight reflecting, just feel free to share those so we can get those moving as quickly as possible. And with no other business, I will conclude this meeting at 6:43.